The year is 1944. Northern Italy bleeds under occupation. In a small workshop on the outskirts of Verona, a man named Marco Bellini bends over a workbench scattered with what others call worthless scrap. Twisted metal from bombed buildings, rusted springs from abandoned vehicles, fragments of steel that most would sweep aside without a second glance. The Italian soldiers patrolling the streets have seen him collecting this debris for weeks. They laugh as he passes, their rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders, their allegiance bought with promises of safety under the fascist regime. They have no idea what he's building. They have no idea that the scrap metal in his calloused hands will become the instrument of their own destruction. If you're enjoying this story of courage and ingenuity during one of history's darkest hours, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful human stories to light. Marco's workshop sits in a narrow alley between two crumbling apartment buildings. The windows are boarded with planks salvaged from destroyed homes. Inside, a single oil lamp casts dancing shadows across walls, stained with decades of smoke and dust. The November air seeps through cracks in the walls, carrying with it the smell of cordite and burning wood from the latest Allied bombardment. Marco works alone, always alone. His wife Elena died 2 years ago when a German convoy fired on civilians fleeing south. His son, barely 16, vanished into the mountains to join the partisans. Marco stayed behind, too old to fight in the forests, but not too old to resist. The Italian Social Republic controls this territory now, Mussolini's puppet state dancing to strings pulled by Berlin. The soldiers who enforce the curfew and check papers at every corner wear Italian uniforms, but they serve German masters. Marco has watched these men, studied their routines with the patience of a clockmaker, examining the gears of a mechanism. He knows which ones drink too much grappa at the Osteria on Via Mazzini. He knows which patrol routes they follow when they sweep the neighborhoods for contraband and resistance sympathizers. He knows their weaknesses, and he plans to exploit every single one. The device taking shape on his workbench is elegant in its simplicity, a pressure-activated mechanism built from salvaged components. The spring comes from a German truck abandoned near the river after running over a partisan mine. The metal plate, smooth and sturdy, was once part of a kitchen stove in an apartment building reduced to rubble by Allied bombs. The detonator, the most dangerous piece, came from an unexploded ordnance he found in a field outside town. He had carried it home wrapped in cloth, his heart hammering with each careful step, knowing that one wrong move would scatter him across the landscape in pieces too small to bury. Every evening, after the last patrol passes his alley, Marco descends into work. His hands, weathered by 47 years of life and 3 years of war, move with surprising delicacy. He files metal until the surfaces fit together seamlessly. He tests springs, measuring resistance with nothing but touch and intuition. There are no manuals for what he's building, no blueprints drawn by engineers. Everything comes from memory, observation, and the desperate creativity of a man who has lost everything except his will to strike back. The Italian soldiers continue their mockery whenever they see him. "Look at the old fool," says Lieutenant Giuliano, a thin man from Naples who wears his fascist loyalty like ill-fitting armor. "Still collecting garbage like a rat in the ruins." His companions laugh, 12 men who have made themselves enemies of their own people. They congregate each morning at a checkpoint near the Ponte Pietra, searching citizens, confiscating food, occasionally dragging someone away for questioning that usually ends in a basement with concrete walls and soundproofing. Marco has memorized each face. Carlo, who hits women during searches. Tommaso, who steals money from the elderly. Pietro, who shot a boy for running after curfew. 12 names, 12 faces, 12 men who believe themselves untouchable. December arrives with freezing rain that turns the streets into rivers of mud and filth. The workshop becomes even colder, but Marco doesn't notice. His entire world has narrowed to the device before him, to calculations and adjustments, and the gnawing question of whether it will actually work. He has no way to test it. A test would mean discovery, arrest, execution. Everything must function perfectly on the first attempt, or he will have failed. Worse, he will have given his life for nothing. On a Thursday evening, Marco finishes the final assembly. The device weighs perhaps 4 kilograms, small enough to conceal in a canvas bag, deadly enough to accomplish what he has planned. He wraps it carefully in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, then hides it beneath the floorboards under his mattress. That night, he doesn't sleep. He lies in darkness, listening to distant artillery fire from the front lines, where the Germans are slowly being pushed back by Allied forces advancing from the south. The liberation is coming, everyone whispers. But liberation means nothing to the dead. Liberation won't return Elena or bring his son down from the mountains. What Marco seeks isn't liberation. It's justice, measured in blood and broken bodies. The next morning, he watches from his window as the 12 soldiers gather at their checkpoint. They're establishing a new routine, inspecting a particular stretch of Via Capello, where resistance activity has been reported. Every morning at 8 o'clock, they form up in the same location, standing in a tight group, while Lieutenant Giuliano briefs them on the day's orders. It's a pattern born of military discipline and the arrogance of men who believe they control the streets. Marco has watched this routine for 2 weeks, noting the precise spot where they stand, the wooden crates they use as makeshift furniture, the cobblestones beneath their boots that have been there since medieval times and will outlast all of them. That afternoon, Marco takes his canvas bag and makes his way through the city. He moves slowly, like a man with nowhere important to be, just another elderly citizen navigating the ruins and shortages of occupied Italy. He stops at a bombed church, crosses himself, mutters a prayer that might be genuine or might be performance. 2 German soldiers pass by, without giving him a second glance. An old man with a bag of scrap metal poses no threat to the Reich. He reaches Via Capello as evening approaches. The checkpoint is empty, the soldiers gone for their daily meal and whatever entertainment they can find in a city that hates them. Marco works quickly, his hands steady despite the fear flooding his system. He places the device beneath a wooden crate, the same crate Lieutenant Giuliano uses as a seat during morning briefings. He positions it carefully, ensuring the pressure plate sits level and stable. The mechanism is simple. When weight presses down, the spring compresses, a pin withdraws, the detonator triggers. He has packed the casing with every sharp fragment of metal he could find, bolts, nails, pieces of shrapnel from German shells. When it explodes, the force will radiate outward in a sphere of destruction that will shred flesh and bone like paper. Marco retreats to a cafe 3 blocks away, a place where old men gather to drink ersatz coffee and pretend they still have normal lives. He orders a cup of the bitter liquid that barely resembles real coffee, sits near the window, and waits. His heart beats with a rhythm that feels too loud, too fast, as if everyone in the cafe must hear it hammering against his ribs. But no one pays him attention. He's invisible, just another tired face in a city full of tired faces. Morning comes cold and grey. Marco positions himself at the cafe before dawn, claiming the same seat by the window. The owner nods to him, pours coffee without being asked. The routine of occupation creates strange intimacies. Outside, the city wakes slowly. Civilians hurry to work or stand in lines for ration distributions. German trucks rumble past, carrying supplies to the front. And then, precisely at 8 o'clock, the 12 Italian soldiers arrive at the checkpoint. Lieutenant Giuliano walks directly to the wooden crate and sits down. His weight settles onto the wood, which transmits the pressure to the device hidden underneath. Marco's fingers tighten around his coffee cup. For a moment, nothing happens. His chest constricts with the horrible possibility that he miscalculated, that the mechanism failed, that his one chance at retribution will end with a dud and his own arrest when they discover the device. Then the world erupts. The explosion is massive, far larger than Marco anticipated. The pressure wave blows out windows across the street, including the cafe window he sits behind. Glass sprays inward, and Marco throws himself to the floor as shards slice through the air above him. The sound deafens, a thunderclap that echoes off stone buildings and rolls through the city like the voice of an angry god. Women scream, men shout. The cafe owner is crying, blood running from a cut on his forehead. Marco staggers to his feet, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. He stumbles to where the window used to be and looks across the street. The checkpoint no longer exists. The wooden crates have been obliterated into splinters. The cobblestones are scorched black, some of them torn from their beds and hurled meters away. And the soldiers, the 12 Italian soldiers who started their morning expecting another routine day of occupation. Marco can see bodies. Some are motionless, sprawled in positions that bodies should never occupy. Others writhe on the ground, screaming, their voices joining the general chaos of alarm and panic. Blood spreads across the ancient stones, pooling in cracks that have survived centuries of foot traffic. An arm lies separated from its owner, still clothed in the grey-green sleeve of the Italian Social Republic uniform. Smoke rises from the crater at the center of the devastation, carrying with it the smell of burning flesh and explosive residue. German soldiers arrive within minutes, their trucks screeching to stops around the scene. They pour out with weapons ready, shouting orders, trying to establish a perimeter, but they're too late. The damage is done. Officers begin examining the scene, realizing immediately that this was no Allied bomb. This was something else, something deliberate, something placed. Marco backs away from the window, moving carefully through the panic in the cafe. People are running in all directions, some toward the explosion out of morbid curiosity, others away from it out of primal fear. In the confusion, no one notices an old man slipping out the back door into an alley. He walks slowly, fighting the urge to run. Running draws attention. Running gets you stopped, questioned, searched. He makes his way through back streets and narrow passages, using routes he memorized during weeks of preparation. His body shakes, not from fear, but from something else. Adrenaline, perhaps. Or the crushing weight of what he's done. He has killed men, 12 of them, if his device performed as designed. 12 human beings, regardless of their crimes or allegiances, are dead because he built a bomb and placed it in their path. By the time he reaches his workshop, German and Italian soldiers are flooding the streets. They're conducting house-to-house searches, rounding up anyone suspicious, demanding papers and explanations. Marco sits at his workbench, surrounded by his scrap metal, and waits. His hands rest on the scarred wood surface, steady now that the waiting is over. If they come for him, he won't run. He's too old and too tired for running. He will face whatever comes with the same determination that guided his hands while building the device. Hours pass. The search comes closer. Marco can hear boots on cobblestones, doors being kicked open, voices raised in anger and fear. The occupation forces are terrified, he realizes. An attack in the heart of their controlled zone, targeting their own collaborators, means the resistance is closer than they thought. It means nowhere is safe. It means the certainty they relied upon, the illusion of control, is crumbling. When the soldiers finally reach his workshop, Marco is ready. They burst through the door with rifles pointed, shouting commands. Marco raises his hands slowly, meeting their eyes without flinching. Lieutenant Kraus, the German officer leading the search, steps forward. He's young, perhaps 25, with cold blue eyes that have seen too much death to be shocked by anything. "Your papers," he demands in heavily accented Italian. Marco produces them from his pocket. The documents are authentic, marking him as Marco Bellini, age 47, occupation listed as metal worker. The lieutenant examines them carefully, then looks around the workshop. His gaze sweeps across the workbench, the scattered scrap metal, the tools hanging on walls. "What do you do here?" Kraus asks. "I repair things," Marco replies, his voice hoarse from the smoke he inhaled during the explosion. "Pots, pans, whatever people bring me. Metal is scarce. Everyone needs repairs." Kraus picks up a piece of scrap, turns it over in his gloved hand. It's a twisted fragment of steel from a destroyed building, identical to dozens of other pieces scattered throughout the workshop. He drops it back onto the workbench with a metallic clatter. "Where were you this morning?" The question comes sharp, accusatory. "At the cafe, Via Nuova. I go there most mornings." Marco meets the lieutenant's stare without wavering. Lying to these men means death, but telling the truth also means death. The only path forward is to walk the narrow line between the two. "The cafe near the explosion." "Yes. I was there when it happened. Terrible thing. The window broke, cut several people." Marco gestures to a small cut on his own cheek, a genuine wound from flying glass. Kraus studies him for a long moment. Marco can see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. Every Italian is a suspect. Every workshop is a potential bomb factory. But there are thousands of Italians in Verona, hundreds of workshops. They can't arrest everyone. They need evidence, or at least reasonable suspicion. "You will come with us for questioning," Kraus finally says. They take Marco to a building near the river, a former administrative office now converted into a headquarters for occupation security forces. He's placed in a small room with concrete walls and a single chair. For 3 hours, they leave him alone. It's a technique he recognizes, meant to build anxiety, to make suspects nervous enough to crack before questioning even begins. But Marco spent the night before the attack unable to sleep, imagining every possible outcome. This scenario is one he already played through in his mind. He uses the time to prepare his story, to ensure every detail aligns perfectly. When the interrogation begins, 2 men enter the room. One is Lieutenant Kraus, the other is an Italian officer from the Social Republic, Captain Moretti, whose reputation for brutality precedes him. They circle Marco like wolves around wounded prey, asking questions, demanding answers, probing for inconsistencies. "You collect scrap metal." "Yes, for repairs." "Where do you get this metal?" "Everywhere. Buildings that were bombed, abandoned vehicles, people bring me things." "Do you know how to build explosive devices?" "No, I'm a metal worker, not a soldier." "Someone with metalworking skills could build a bomb." "I suppose. I wouldn't know how." The questions continue for hours. They ask about his movements over the past weeks, about people he's spoken to, about any contact with partisan groups. Marco answers each question carefully, providing just enough detail to sound truthful without offering anything that could incriminate him. He admits to being at the cafe. He describes the explosion. He shows them the cut on his face from the broken window. Everything he says can be verified, and every verification will support his story of being an innocent victim caught near a tragic event. Eventually, they release him. Not because they believe him, Marco realizes, but because they have nothing concrete. No witness placed him near the checkpoint before the explosion. No evidence in his workshop directly links to bomb construction. The components he used were so common, so ubiquitous in a city full of scrap and salvage, that they could have come from anywhere. The detonator, the one piece that might have betrayed him, was destroyed in the explosion. Marco walks home through streets filled with soldiers and checkpoints. The occupation forces have tripled their presence. Every corner has guards. Every alley is watched. But he feels no fear now. Whatever happens next is beyond his control. He did what he set out to do. 12 collaborators are dead, 12 men who terrorized civilians, who served the fascists, who betrayed their own people. The price of that action might be his own life, but that price seems small compared to what was taken from him. News of the attack spreads through Verona like fire through dry grass. The resistance claims responsibility, though Marco never contacted them. His action, taken independently, becomes absorbed into the larger narrative of partisan warfare. The Germans respond with collective punishment, arresting dozens of suspected partisans, executing 10 civilians in the public square as a warning. Marco watches from his window as the bodies hang from lampposts, swaying in the winter wind. Their deaths weigh on him. These people died because of what he did. Innocent people killed in retaliation for his act of vengeance. He sits in his workshop that night, unable to work, unable to sleep, wrestling with the mathematics of violence. 12 collaborators dead. 10 innocent civilians executed in response. Is the equation balanced? Does justice work through such brutal arithmetic? He has no answers, only the gnawing certainty that war transforms everyone it touches, turning ordinary people into killers and victims into statistics. Winter deepens. The front lines move closer as Allied forces push north through Italy. German resistance stiffens, but the outcome is inevitable. Liberation approaches, measured in kilometers gained and towns recaptured. Marco continues his routine, repairing pots and pans, collecting scrap metal, visiting the cafe each morning. The soldiers who replace the dead collaborators watch him with suspicion, but they have no proof. He becomes a ghost in his own city, visible but untouchable, a man surrounded by secrets that he will carry to his grave. In February, a young partisan makes contact with him. The boy, barely 18, arrives at the workshop after dark. He carries a message from the resistance command in the mountains. They want to know if the bombing was Marco's work. They want to know if he can build more devices. They want to recruit him, to make him part of their network. Marco refuses. "I'm not a partisan," he tells the boy. "I'm just a man who lost everything and wanted those responsible to pay. I got my revenge. That's enough." The partisan tries to argue, speaking of duty and the larger fight for freedom. But Marco shakes his head. "Go back to the mountains," he says. "Tell your commanders that whoever bombed the checkpoint is finished. That person did what needed to be done and won't be doing it again." The boy leaves, disappearing into the night. Marco never sees him again. But word must reach the resistance leadership because no one else comes asking questions. The mysterious bomber of Via Capello becomes another small legend in the larger story of Italian resistance, a footnote in history that will be forgotten or conflated with other acts of sabotage. April brings the sound of artillery growing louder. The Germans begin their retreat, pulling back toward the Alps in fighting withdrawals that leave the roads clogged with destroyed vehicles and dead soldiers. The Italian Social Republic collapses as its members flee or switch allegiances. In the chaos of liberation, old scores are settled. Collaborators are dragged from their homes and executed in the streets. Women accused of fraternizing with Germans have their heads shaved and are paraded through towns as objects of public humiliation. The violence Marco unleashed in December seems restrained compared to the vengeance that sweeps through northern Italy in April. On the 28th of April, Benito Mussolini is captured by partisans near Lake Como while attempting to flee to Switzerland. They execute him and his mistress, then transport the bodies to Milan, where they're hung upside down from meat hooks at a gas station. Marco hears the news from neighbors who gather in the street celebrating. The dictator is dead. The war in Italy is effectively over, but Marco feels no joy, no sense of victory. He feels only emptiness, a hollow space where his anger used to burn. May brings Allied troops into Verona, British soldiers in their khaki uniforms, American GIs with their easy confidence and endless cigarettes. They're greeted as liberators, and for the most part, they are. The occupation ends. The checkpoints disappear. People emerge from years of fear and privation, blinking in the sunlight like prisoners released from dark cells. Marco continues working in his shop. Life returns to a semblance of normalcy, though nothing will ever truly be normal again. The war has carved scars too deep to heal completely. One morning in June, a British officer visits the workshop. Captain Thompson, he introduces himself, with the Intelligence Corps. He's investigating war crimes and resistance activities, trying to document what happened during the occupation. "I've been reviewing German and Italian records," Thompson explains in careful Italian. "There was an incident in December, an explosion that killed 12 Italian soldiers serving the Social Republic. Do you know anything about it?" Marco meets the officer's eyes. He's past the point of fear. If they've come to arrest him now, after everything, so be it. "I heard about it," he says. "Terrible thing. Many people were injured." Thompson nods slowly. "The Germans suspected partisan activity, conducted extensive searches, never found who was responsible." He pauses, studying Marco's face. "Those 12 soldiers had quite a record. Beatings, theft, murder of civilians, not nice people. War brings out the worst in many men," Marco replies. "Indeed it does." Thompson pulls out a notebook, flips through pages. "I've interviewed dozens of people in this neighborhood. Several mentioned seeing you collect scrap metal in the weeks before the bombing. Said the soldiers used to mock you for it." Marco says nothing. There's nothing to say. Either the British officer has enough evidence to make an arrest, or he's fishing. Speaking now would only provide material for whatever case they're building. Thompson closes his notebook and stands. "The world's a complicated place, Mr. Bellini. Sometimes justice comes through official channels. Sometimes it comes from other sources." He extends his hand. "Thank you for your time." Marco shakes the offered hand, confused by the officer's attitude. Thompson walks to the door, then pauses. "For what it's worth," he says without turning around, "those 12 men won't be missed. The world's better without them." Then he's gone, leaving Marco alone with the implication hanging in the air like smoke. Summer passes into autumn. Marco's son returns from the mountains, thinner and harder than when he left, carrying scars both visible and hidden. They don't speak much about the war years. Some experiences resist language, existing in a space beyond words, where only those who lived through them can understand. His son finds work at a factory being rebuilt outside the city. Life moves forward because that's what life does, even after everything breaks. On a December morning, exactly 1 year after the bombing, Marco walks to Via Capello. The crater has been filled in, the cobblestones replaced. New buildings are rising where old ones were destroyed. You wouldn't know that 12 men died here, that blood soaked into the ancient stones, that an act of desperate violence occurred in this exact spot. The city has already moved on, too busy rebuilding to dwell on the dead. Marco stands there for several minutes, remembering. Not the explosion or the bodies, but the nights in his workshop, the careful assembly of components, the precise calculations that meant the difference between success and failure. He remembers the weight of the device in his hands, the knowledge that what he was building would kill. He remembers the moment when Lieutenant Giuliano sat down on the crate, those few eternal seconds before the mechanism triggered. "I hope it was worth it," he whispers to the empty street. "I hope Elena would understand." But the dead don't answer questions, and the past offers no absolution. He turns and walks back toward his workshop, an old man carrying the weight of decisions that can never be unmade. The workshop becomes his sanctuary and his prison. He fills the days with work, repairing the endless stream of damaged goods that people bring him, broken tools, dented pots, furniture with fractured joints. He fixes things because that's what he knows how to do, what he's always done. But late at night, when sleep won't come, he thinks about the device. How simple it was, how effective, how easily scrap metal and salvaged components could be transformed into an instrument of death. He thinks about the Italian soldiers, the 12 who died, and the dozens who replaced them. He wonders about their families, whether they had wives who mourned them or children who would grow up without fathers. The war dehumanized everyone, turned individuals into abstractions. Fascists, collaborators, enemies. It was easier to kill an abstraction than to kill a person. But lying awake in the darkness, Marco can't escape the reality that he killed 12 human beings, regardless of what they represented or what crimes they committed. His son visits on Sundays, bringing small gifts of food or tobacco. They sit in the workshop, not quite comfortable with each other, separated by experiences that can't be shared. The silence between them carries weight, filled with questions neither knows how to ask. Marco watches his son's hands, noticing scars across the knuckles, a missing fingernail that will never grow back. These are the marks of war, written in flesh and bone, permanent reminders of things that happened in the mountains, where partisans fought and died far from the eyes of history. One Sunday in spring, as rain drums against the workshop roof and creates rivers in the streets outside, his son asks the question that's been hanging between them for months. The bombing last December, the checkpoint on Via Capello. He doesn't finish the sentence, doesn't need to. The words hang in the air between them, heavy with implication. Marco looks at his son, seeing the young man who left for the mountains and the scarred survivor who returned. The boy who once dreamed of becoming a teacher is gone, replaced by someone harder, someone who has seen and done things that changed him fundamentally. "Some things are better left unspoken," he finally says, his voice rough with emotion. His son nods slowly, accepting the non-answer. The partisans talked about it, said it was brilliant, said whoever did it understood weapons and timing. They wanted to find the person, recruit them. He pauses, studying his father's face with eyes that have learned to read truth beneath surface words. They spent weeks asking questions, following leads. One commander was convinced it was someone with military training, maybe a former soldier who'd gone underground. Another thought it might have been a group working together, pooling their knowledge. They never considered it could be one person, working alone, using nothing but scrap. Marco remains silent, letting his son speak, understanding that confession is sometimes a gift given rather than a burden shared. "I never told them anything," his son continues. "Never even mentioned that you work with metal. Never mentioned the weeks you spent collecting materials, or how you'd come home with your pockets full of springs and wires and pieces I didn't understand the purpose of. I watched you, Papa. I saw you working late into the night when you thought I was asleep. I heard you in the workshop, testing things, making calculations. I knew something was happening, but I was too afraid to ask what." "Thank you," Marco says quietly, "for your silence, for not asking questions I couldn't have answered honestly." "Papa." His son's voice cracks slightly, revealing the boy still hiding beneath the hardened exterior. "Were they right? The soldiers at that checkpoint, Carlo, who hit women during searches, Tommaso, who stole from the elderly, Pietro, who shot that boy for running after curfew, all 12 of them, they deserved what happened to them, didn't they?" Marco has wrestled with this question every day since the bombing. It haunts him in quiet moments, appears in dreams, whispers accusations in the darkness when sleep won't come. "Justice and revenge are different things," he says slowly, choosing each word with care. "What those men did was evil. They terrorized people, killed innocents, served an evil cause. They chose to collaborate with fascists when they could have chosen resistance, or at least passive non-cooperation. Did they deserve to die? Maybe. Probably. But I'm not sure I had the right to make that judgment." I'm not a judge appointed by any legitimate authority. I'm just a man who lost his wife and wanted someone to pay for it. The admission cost him something to speak aloud. For months, he's avoided confronting the core truth of his actions. Revenge, not justice. Personal vengeance, not righteous resistance. The device he built was born from grief and rage, not from any carefully considered moral philosophy about occupation and collaboration. 10 civilians were executed in retaliation. His son says softly, speaking the words that Marco has repeated to himself 1,000 times. Do you think about them? Every day. Marco's voice is barely a whisper. Every single day. Their blood is on my hands as much as the soldiers' blood. I killed them too, indirectly but certainly. That's the price of violence. It spreads like disease, touching the innocent along with the guilty. When I placed that device beneath the crate, I knew there would be consequences. I knew the Germans and their collaborators would retaliate. But knowing something intellectually and seeing it happen are different things. When they hung those 10 people in the square, when I watched them die for something I did, that's when the full weight of my choice became real. His son leans forward, elbows on knees, face troubled. In the mountains, we talked about this constantly, about the cost of resistance. Every time we ambushed a German patrol, we knew they'd burn a village in retaliation. Every time we sabotaged a supply line, we knew civilians would be punished. But we kept fighting anyway, because the alternative was to submit, to let evil win without opposition. How do you make that calculation? How do you decide that the deaths of innocents are worth the damage you inflict on the enemy? I don't know, Marco admits. Maybe there's no good answer. Maybe we just do what we think is right in the moment, and spend the rest of our lives wondering if we made the correct choice. The partisans had political justifications, military objectives, a sense of being part of something larger than themselves. I had none of that. I just had grief and anger, and a workshop full of scrap metal. So maybe my actions were less justified than yours. Or maybe all violence is equally troubling, regardless of the philosophy we wrap around it to make ourselves feel better. They sit together as the rain continues, 2 men bound by blood and shared trauma, trying to make sense of choices that may not have sensible explanations. The workshop feels smaller suddenly, the walls closer, as if the weight of their conversation is literally compressing the space around them. Marco thinks about Elena, about the boy his son used to be, about the 12 soldiers and the 10 civilians, and all the other casualties of a war that turned ordinary people into killers and victims into statistics. Would you do it again? His son finally asks, voice barely audible over the rain. Knowing what you know now about the retaliation and the civilians and the weight you'd carry afterward, if you could go back to that moment, to that decision, would you still build that device? They sit in silence for a long time. Outside, the city continues its recovery. Buildings rise from rubble. Streets fill with traffic. Children play in squares where soldiers once patrolled. Italy is healing, or at least pretending to heal, covering its wounds with new construction and forced optimism. Would you do it again? His son asks. Knowing what you know now about the retaliation and the civilians, would you still build that device? Marco considers the question with the seriousness it deserves. Honest reflection requires confronting uncomfortable truths, examining motives that may not have been as pure as he'd like to believe. I don't know, he admits after a long silence. Part of me says no, that the cost was too high, that I should have found another way to channel my grief. Part of me remembers your mother bleeding in the street, remembers her last words asking me to take care of you, remembers holding her while she died and being unable to do anything to save her. That part says yes, absolutely without hesitation. Those collaborators enabled her death. They served a system that killed her. They deserved whatever happened to them. He pauses, struggling to articulate the complexity of emotions that still churn inside him years later. Maybe that's the real answer. Maybe I'm both people at once, the man who regrets and the man who would do it again. War breaks people into pieces that don't fit back together properly. We become collections of contradictions, capable of holding opposing truths simultaneously. I can believe that what I did was wrong and still feel satisfaction knowing those 12 men are dead. I can grieve for the 10 innocents executed in retaliation and still not wish I'd made a different choice. Maybe that makes me a monster. Or maybe it just makes me human in circumstances that allowed no room for pure morality. His son absorbs this, processing words that confirm what he suspected but never had validated. Around them, the workshop continues its timeless existence, filled with tools and materials that care nothing for human philosophy or moral quandaries. Metal doesn't judge. Springs compress and release according to physical laws that exist independent of ethics. The scraps scattered across workbenches served Marco's purpose without questioning whether that purpose was righteous or damned. The resistance is organizing reunions, his son says, changing the subject but not really moving away from the core question. They want to honor those who fought during the occupation. They're calling us heroes, talking about medals and ceremonies and official recognition. Some government ministry is compiling records, documenting everything that happened during the war years. They sent someone to interview me last month, asking about operations in the mountains, about actions taken against German forces. Are you going to the reunion? Marco asks, sensing his son's ambivalence. I don't know. Are we heroes? The partisans, I mean. We killed people, we destroyed things, we did terrible things for what we believed was a good cause. We executed collaborators without trials. We burned buildings with people inside when intelligence suggested they were being used by fascist authorities. We planted bombs that killed soldiers, but also sometimes killed bystanders. Does that make us heroes, or just survivors who got lucky enough to win, and therefore get to write ourselves into history as the good guys? Marco recognizes his own doubts reflected in his son's questions, sees the same moral uncertainty that has plagued him manifested in the next generation. The war is over, but its aftermath stretches forward endlessly, a shadow that will follow them for the rest of their lives, haunting their thoughts and troubling their consciences. Go to the reunion if you want, he says carefully. Spend time with people who understand what you went through. That has value, regardless of what you call yourselves or how history ultimately judges your actions. Sometimes the only people who can understand what war does to you are the ones who experienced it alongside you. That shared knowledge, that mutual recognition of trauma and choice and consequence, that's worth preserving. He thinks about Captain Thompson, the British intelligence officer who came asking questions and left with implications hanging in the air. That man understood, recognized something in Marco that official records and investigations would never capture. Maybe that's all any of them can hope for. To be seen and understood by those few people capable of grasping the terrible complexity of living through impossible times. Will you tell them? His son asks. If they come asking about the bombing, will you tell them it was you? No. Marco's answer comes immediately certain. What good would that serve? The men are dead. Justice or revenge or whatever it was, it's done. Claiming credit now would only reopen old wounds, force authorities to make decisions about prosecution or recognition or how to categorize an act that doesn't fit neatly into their frameworks. Better to let it remain a mystery, an unsolved case that people can interpret however they choose. After his son leaves, Marco returns to his workbench. There's a radio someone brought in for repair, its internal wiring damaged by moisture from a leaking roof. He opens the casing carefully and begins the methodical process of diagnosis and repair. It's simple work, the kind that quiets the mind and focuses the hands on concrete problems with definable solutions. He loses himself in it, grateful for the distraction, for the opportunity to fix something rather than break it. The radio's components spread across his workbench, each piece serving a clear purpose in making the whole function. He traces wires with patient fingers, identifies corroded connections, replaces damaged elements with salvaged parts from his collection of scrap. There's honesty in this work. A radio either works or it doesn't. Success is measurable, failure's obvious. Unlike moral questions about violence and revenge, unlike philosophical debates about justice and retaliation, radio repair offers clarity. Fix the broken pieces, restore the connections, test the results. No ambiguity, no lingering doubt. Years pass with the steady rhythm of seasons changing and cities rebuilding. The workshop remains a constant in Verona, while the city around it transforms from wartime ruin into modern prosperity. The scars of bombardment disappear beneath new construction. Streets once patrolled by German soldiers fill with automobile traffic and bustling commerce. Young people grow up with no memory of occupation, of fear, of the constant presence of death. They know the stories, learn the history in schools, visit museums and memorials dedicated to preserving the past. But they can't truly understand. How could they? Some things can only be learned through experience, and these are precisely the things better left unlearned. Marco grows old, with the kind of inevitability that affects everyone lucky or unlucky enough to survive violent times. His hands, once steady enough to assemble explosive mechanisms from salvaged components, begin to shake with age. Arthritis settles into joints worn down by decades of metalwork, making fine manipulations difficult and sometimes impossible. The precision that once allowed him to build a device capable of killing 12 men now struggles with tasks as simple as threading a wire through an eyelet. He trains a young apprentice named Giovanni, a boy barely 15 who shows aptitude for the patient, detailed work that metalsmithing requires. Marco teaches him the skills accumulated over a lifetime, how to judge metal by sound and feel, how to repair rather than replace, how to see potential in things others discard as worthless. The boy knows nothing of Marco's past, sees only a patient teacher with vast knowledge and endless patience. To Giovanni, Marco is simply the old man who runs the workshop on the narrow alley, who can fix anything made of metal, who sometimes stares into space as if seeing things invisible to others. One evening, while organizing tools in preparation for closing the workshop, Giovanni finds a small metal box hidden in the back of a drawer. It's plain, unmarked, easily overlooked. Curious in the way of young people, he opens it before Marco can respond. Inside are fragments that mean nothing to anyone but their owner, a piece of spring steel, carefully preserved despite having no obvious purpose, a bent nail, rusted but intact, a section of wire with specific gauge and composition, several screws of unusual manufacture. Small chunks of metal with no identifying characteristics, scraps that any sensible person would have thrown away years ago, but which Marco has kept with the dedication others reserve for precious heirlooms. "What's this?" Giovanni asks, examining the contents with confusion. "Scrap pieces." "Why save them?" Marco takes the box gently from his apprentice's hands and closes the lid with a soft click that sounds unnaturally loud in the quiet workshop. "Reminders," he says, his voice carrying weight that makes the boy look up sharply. "Of things I'd prefer to forget but can't afford to." The apprentice doesn't understand, but he's young and the question doesn't seem important enough to pursue. He senses something profound in Marco's tone, something that suggests depths he's not equipped to explore. He returns to his work, sweeping metal shavings from the floor, organizing tools for the next day, performing the mundane tasks that keep the workshop functioning. Meanwhile, Marco sits with the box of fragments, running his fingers over components that once fit together to create something deadly, now separated and powerless, but still carrying the weight of what they were used for. On a cold December night, nearly 20 years after the bombing, Marco lies in bed unable to sleep. His body aches with the accumulated damage of 70 years of life, old injuries from working with metal and machinery, the general deterioration that age inflicts on everyone who lives long enough. His mind wanders through decades of memories, sorting through experiences like someone organizing a drawer full of important documents, trying to make sense of the archive before it's too late. Inevitably, his thoughts settle on that morning in 1944 when the world exploded on Via Capello. The memory remains vivid despite the passage of time, preserved with a clarity that other recollections lack. He can still see it all as if watching a film projected onto the ceiling above his bed. The flash of light so bright it momentarily blinded him even from blocks away. The sound that started as a crack and expanded into a roar that seemed to shake the foundations of ancient buildings. The window of the cafe shattering, glass transforming into thousands of projectiles that sliced through air and flesh indiscriminately. He remembers the bodies, sees them now as clearly as he did then. Some motionless, sprawled in positions that human bodies should never occupy, limbs at angles that violated the architecture of bone and joint. Others writhing on the ground, screaming in voices that carried animal terror, unfiltered by human dignity or restraint. Blood spreading across the ancient cobblestones, pooling in cracks that had survived centuries of foot traffic, seeping into spaces that had witnessed countless other moments of violence across Verona's long history. The weight of what he'd done settled onto his shoulders in that moment, and it has never lifted. Some burdens can't be put down, can't be shared, can't be absolved through confession or forgiveness. They become part of who you are, integrated into your identity as thoroughly as memories of childhood or the sound of a loved one's voice. Marco accepted this burden 20 years ago, and he carries it still, will carry it until death finally relieves him of consciousness and responsibility. He thinks about the Italian soldiers who mocked him, who never imagined that the old fool collecting scrap could hurt them. Their laughter echoes across the years, hollow now, meaningless in retrospect. They saw an elderly man bent under the weight of salvaged materials, never recognizing the intelligence working behind tired eyes, never suspecting that observation and planning were taking place beneath a facade of harmless eccentricity. Their failure of imagination killed them. They couldn't conceive of an enemy who didn't wear a uniform, who didn't operate as part of an organized military force, who built weapons alone in a workshop using nothing but scrap and determination. Lieutenant Giuliano sitting on the wooden crate, unwittingly triggering the mechanism that would kill him and 11 others. Those few eternal seconds before the device activated, when everything hung in perfect balance between potential and kinetic energy, between planning and execution, between life and death. Marco has replayed that moment thousands of times, examining it from every angle, questioning whether there was any part of him that hoped it would fail, that wanted to preserve those 12 lives despite everything they represented. He's never found evidence of mercy in his memories. He wanted them dead, and he built a device that accomplished exactly that. The moral weight of intentional killing, of premeditated murder, regardless of how you frame the justification, remains constant. The 10 civilians executed in retaliation. Marco forces himself to remember their names, to preserve their identities even as the city around him forgets. Andrea Rossi, a baker who made bread from whatever flour could be found during the shortages. Maria Conti, a schoolteacher who continued instructing children even when schools were officially closed. Giuseppe Lombardi, a physician who treated anyone regardless of their ability to pay or their political affiliations. 7 others whose names and faces he's memorized, whose deaths he carries as his personal responsibility. The Germans and their collaborators pulled these people from their homes, lined them up in the public square, and shot them as punishment for an act they had no connection to. Their blood is on Marco's hands, as surely as if he'd pulled the triggers himself. This is what resistance costs. This is what fighting back means in occupied territory. Every act of violence against the occupiers invites reprisal against the occupied. Every German soldier killed leads to 20 civilians executed. Every bridge destroyed results in a village burned. The mathematics of occupation are brutal and precise, designed to make resistance unbearable by ensuring that the innocent pay for the actions of the rebellious. Marco understood this before he built the device, but understanding something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally are vastly different things. He wonders, as he has wondered countless times before, whether the equation balances. 12 collaborators who enabled atrocities, who participated in occupation, who served evil ends. 10 innocent civilians who died simply for living in the wrong place at the wrong time. Is that a favorable exchange? Does killing those who actively harm justify the inevitable deaths of those who committed no crime? The partisan commanders in the mountains had political theories about acceptable casualties and necessary sacrifices. Marco has no such theoretical framework. He has only the faces of the dead, both the guilty and the innocent, and the knowledge that he's responsible for all of them. And always, underneath every other thought, is Elena, her face fading with time, but never disappearing completely, like a photograph exposed to sunlight, the details becoming less distinct, but the essential image remaining. He can still hear her voice, though he's no longer certain whether what he remembers is accurate or whether he's reconstructed it from imagination and need. She used to sing while working in the kitchen, old songs her grandmother taught her, melodies that carried across generations. Those songs died with her, lost because Marco never learned them properly, never paid enough attention when preservation might have mattered. Would she approve of what he did? The question haunts him because it has no answerable solution. Elena was kind, genuinely good in ways that Marco never quite achieved. She saw the best in people, believed in redemption and forgiveness, approached the world with generosity that seemed naive, but was actually a form of courage. Would that woman have understood the rage and grief that drove her husband to build a bomb and kill 12 men? Would she have forgiven him for the 10 innocents who died in consequence? Or would she be horrified by the violence her death inspired, sickened by the knowledge that her murder became justification for additional murders? Marco has no answers. The dead keep their counsel, maintaining silence that can be interpreted any way the living choose. He's created versions of Elena in his mind that approve and condemn, that understand and reject, that forgive and judge. None of these versions are real. They're all projections of his own hopes and fears, his need for absolution, and his recognition that some actions place you beyond the possibility of being absolved. The real Elena exists only in memory, frozen at the moment of her death, unable to offer the guidance or forgiveness he desperately wants. He's tried to be a good man in the aftermath of a terrible act. That's what the years since the bombing have been about, an extended attempt to balance moral scales through positive actions. He's raised his son, providing support and stability in a world that offered neither. He's trained apprentices, passing along skills and knowledge to younger generations. He's contributed to his community's recovery, participating in the collective work of rebuilding what the war destroyed. He's lived quietly, harming no one, helping where he could. But nothing erases what happened on Via Capello. Nothing balances the moral ledger or cleanses the blood from his hands. As dawn breaks over Verona, light spilling across rooftops and filling streets with the promise of a new day, Marco makes peace with the one truth he's certain of. He is not a hero. He is not a villain. He is simply a man who, when pushed beyond endurance, fought back with the only tools available to him. Whether that makes him righteous or damned, whether history will judge him kindly or harshly, matters less than the fact that he lived according to his own conscience in a time when conscience itself was under assault. The scrap metal that Italian soldiers laughed at became their executioner. The old fool they dismissed killed 12 of them with nothing but salvaged components and desperate ingenuity. And now, decades later, the man who built that device carries the weight of it still, a burden that will follow him to whatever comes after this life. In the end, that's all any of us can do. We make choices in impossible circumstances. We live with consequences we can't always predict. We try to be better than the worst things we've done and forgive ourselves when we fall short. Marco Bellini did terrible things during a terrible war. He also lost everything and fought back the only way he could. Both truths coexist, neither cancelling the other, both woven into the fabric of a life that defies simple judgment. The sun rises fully now, casting golden light across the workshop where Marco has spent so many years. He rises from bed, dresses slowly and makes his way downstairs. There's work to be done. There's always work to be done, and perhaps that's the final grace afforded to survivors. The opportunity to keep moving forward, to find purpose in simple acts, to build rather than destroy. The scrap metal on his workbench waits, ready to be transformed into something useful, something that repairs rather than ruins. And Marco, older now but still capable, picks up his tools and begins again.